Where did it come from? There are those who claim that Halloween is a purely pagan or satanic festival, but the truth is that a lot of the rituals, as we will see, seem to have come from Christianity, developing in the late Middle Ages and early modern era, and it is very hard to separate what came from a Christian tradition and what came from a pre-Christian tradition. All Saints' Day was also known as All Hallows Day. The night before it then, on which a vigil was held, was known as All Hallows Evening. Much later in Scotland, it was shortened to Hallows Even. I believe you see where I'm going with this. It's where we get the word Halloween. Later, the date of November 2nd was turned into All Souls Day in remembrance of all the souls of deceased Christians, with special attention to those souls still in purgatory. Together, these 3 days are known in the Christian religion as the All Hallowtide, or Hallowmas. This was still not really Halloween, however. That holiday still had a long way to go, but this form of celebration did resemble it in important ways, and would eventually give rise to it as it stuck around and developed in medieval through early modern Europe. By the late Middle Ages, many customs had developed surrounding the All Hallowtide in Western and Central European countries. Bells were rung in mourning of the dead across cities. Churches displayed holy relics and encouraged parishioners to dress up in costumes resembling their favorite saints. Another interesting tradition of dressing up on this day revolved around the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre. It came from a medieval Christian artistic allegory meant to show that both king and peasant were equal in death, joining together in the eternal dance, and that only service to God was what mattered in the end. Some Christians believed that the dead actually rose on this night to perform this dance. In parties and such, people dressed up as people from all social backgrounds and danced together. This reminded medieval Christians that all earthly things eventually come to an end. Emperor, your sword won't help you out. Scepter and crown are worthless here. I've taken you by the hand, for you must come to my dance. The concept of souling had developed as well. As early as the 14th century, people, typically children of a poorer background, would go door to door asking for soul cakes. The cakes typically had crosses on them and were made with some sort of spices. In return for the cakes, the children would offer prayers to people in purgatory. This simultaneously was encouraged by the Christian requirement for charity. It was also believed by many Christians that the souls of the dead came down to earth on their journey from purgatory to heaven on this day, and food was left out for them. These young soulers would sometimes symbolically imitate these spirits and accept offerings on their behalf. Dressing up may have also been a way to protect oneself from the spirits. While souling, these children may have carried lanterns made from hollowed turnips. This practice continued until the early 20th century and was practiced in places like England by both Protestants and Catholics. Soul cake, pray you good mistress a soul cake. 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for him that made us all. It's important to note this activity may have been more common on Christmas at certain times, however, rather than on the All Hallowtide, which may be where collecting charity money by going Christmas caroling comes from. Another common tradition was to light candles in memory of the dead, something which is still a very common practice. They were not simply for the sake of commemoration, however. They were sometimes lit to guide benevolent spirits back to their families and to keep the demons of Satan back in the darkness. Bowls of milk and other foods were also left at the sides of graves in parts of Europe. In the 16th century, interpretation on how to celebrate the All Hallowtide began to vary as Christianity began to split into a large number of denominations following the Protestant Reformation. Many groups regarded the concept of purgatory as papist or Catholic nonsense, while other Protestants held on to these beliefs or developed equivalents through different interpretations of the Bible. The Reformation caused quite a bit of dispute among Europeans, not all of it friendly. In fact, very little was friendly. In 1605, a radical named Guy Fawkes attempted to blow up the English House of Lords in order to assassinate the Protestant King James I in an attempt to bring England back to the Catholic Church. His plot failed, however, and he was arrested on the 5th of November and later executed. Ever since then, the 5th of November has remained as Guy Fawkes Day, or Bonfire Night, throughout much of England. It's not a Halloween celebration, but many traditions, such as lighting bonfires, though with his effigy on top of them, were adopted by the English as secular celebrations, mocking Guy Fawkes' failure, and may have influenced Halloween as well. The next major transition in our story comes with European culture making its way to the New World. Throughout the 17th and 18th century, the Americas were colonized primarily by the Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch. Christianity, of course, came with them, and with their Christian religion, in many circumstances, came the All Hallows Eve religious celebrations. In the 13 colonies of America, many different kinds of Christians could be found. To groups like the Puritans, All Hallows Eve was not celebrated whatsoever, along with other church holidays like Christmas and Easter, but other groups like Catholics and Anglicans still recognized it. Time passed, and eventually, the 13 English colonies became their own country, and opened their doors to people across Europe. One main group are crucial to this story: the Irish, with some help from the Scottish, though not as many Scots came to America. Today, around 30% of Americans have Irish ancestry, compared to about 8% with Scottish ancestry, though the Scots-Irish are included under Irish. Anyway, these Irishmen and Scots brought with them some of the traditions of their home countries, some of which might have developed in recent centuries, others perhaps being far older. As they grew in number, more and more Americans became interested in them. The Irish and Scottish especially practiced the art of turnip carving on Halloween. They were not used merely as lanterns though, as was mentioned before, but may have had faces carved into them to represent souls in purgatory or to ward off evil spirits, such as the spirit of the infamous Jack of the Lantern, whom we will soon discuss. In America, however, they discovered a fruit for the job which was much easier to work with: the pumpkin. Pumpkins had been carved in America ever since perhaps the 1820s or 30s, though they weren't necessarily a Halloween practice, but rather just a fall activity. The Celts were happy to adopt the practice, however, and within a century, pumpkin carving became a Halloween thing. Harvest or autumn parties across America throughout the 1800s began picking up traditions that we would consider to be Halloween-ish, slowly evolving into our current holiday. So, having mentioned that, who was this Jack of the Lantern anyway? Stingy Jack, Drunk Jack, or Jack of the Lantern is a character in pre-modern Irish folklore. He was a vile, lying, cheating, manipulative scoundrel who played tricks on people, stole from them, and was otherwise a burden to society. One night, Jack was drunk, wandering through the countryside, when he came upon a figure in the road. This figure turned out to be Satan himself. Satan had heard tales of Jack's depravity and simply had to come see Jack for himself. He told Jack he was there to take his soul and bring him to hell. Jack grew quite depressed and begged Satan for him to satisfy just one last request. He asked Satan if he could have another drink before going to the eternal fires of hell. Satan agreed, and off they went to a nearby pub. After drinking several ales, he asked Satan to pay by turning into a silver coin. A strange request, but fair enough. Not that I expected any more from you, said Satan, and he did so. However, when he did so, Jack stuck the coin in his pocket next to a crucifix, which prevented Satan from returning to his original form. Jack then demanded of Satan to let him live for another year. Satan agreed, and they parted ways. Time passed, and exactly 1 year later, in the same circumstances, Jack came upon Satan on the road again. Jack asked Satan once again for a final request, a much simpler request this time. Jack simply wanted an apple. That's it, just a fruit before eternal damnation. Satan agreed. Evidently, he had not learned his lesson from Jack's trickery. He went to the nearest apple tree to pick an apple. As he did so, Jack placed crucifixes around the tree, preventing Satan from leaving it. Ironic that Satan found himself in trouble after picking fruit from a tree. He was furious and demanded his release, but once again, Jack forced him to accept his demands. "I'll let you go," said Jack, "but you must swear to me never to take me to hell." Satan was forced to agree, and once more, they parted ways. Eventually, though, Jack's lifestyle took a toll on him, and he did, indeed, die. His soul prepared to enter heaven, but as he approached the gates, God turned him away. There was no way Jack was going to enter heaven after having lived such a sinful lifestyle. Jack then went to the gates of hell and begged Satan to allow him to come in. Hell, he supposed, was better than wandering the netherworld alone for eternity. But Satan had made him a deal. Jack was never to come to hell. Instead, Satan scooped up an ember from the fires of hell and gave it to Jack to be placed in a turnip, to be used as a lantern for him to see as he wandered the earth at night for eternity. As this ghostly figure, according to legend, could be seen wandering the roads and countryside of Ireland in the darkness with this turnip lantern, he earned his name, Jack of the Lantern, or Jack-o'-lantern. Tales of Stingy Jack vary quite a bit, but that was a very stereotypical version of the story, and thus a tradition was born. The idea of Stingy Jack wandering the countryside may have been encouraged by the will-o'-the-wisp, a mythical spirit fire, known scientifically in Latin as the ignis fatuus, the fool's fire. These are naturally occurring bursts of flammable gas that appear over bogs and marshlands. The sudden appearance of flames of a variety of colors, occasionally and suddenly flashing over the countryside, encouraged all manner of folklore, as one might expect. When people observed these things, many no doubt thought that it was truly Jack of the Lantern wandering the countryside. This was not the only tradition that the Irish and Scots brought with them to America, however. Other traditions survived as well. It was a common occurrence for children there to dress up in costumes and go door to door asking for coins or food on this night, a practice known as guising, likely related to souling. As far as North America goes, this tradition was first reported to have been practiced in Ontario, Canada in the 1910s, and not long after was reported in the United States as well. Children were guising in the city of Chicago by 1920, but in Anoka, Minnesota in 1920, they were already having Halloween parades. Today, this small American city outside of Minneapolis, of around 17,000 people, prides itself on being the Halloween capital of the world. This wasn't exactly trick-or-treating though, and indeed the term trick-or-treat doesn't seem to have come about until the late 1930s, and was invented in America. In Ireland and Scotland, children might have even performed for the treats, singing a song or playing a flute, similar to another possible influence of trick-or-treating and again Christmas caroling. The practice may have been influenced by the practice of mumming, people across Western Europe dressing up in costumes and performing around holidays to the public in hopes of a donation, much like current street performers still do. What does trick-or-treat really even mean anyway? The treat part is obvious, but what's with the trick? Are they saying, give up the candy, or else? Well, yeah. While there is definitely a good degree of trickery that does go on during Halloween, this is almost always just harmless fun today. However, it was actually derived from a real set of circumstances. In Ireland and Scotland, people who gave to soulers or guisers could expect good fortune, but those who denied gifts to them could expect misfortune. Some children, too impatient to wait for divine intervention, decided to bring the misfortune to these homes themselves. In the early 20th century, children were accustomed to using the night of October 30th, actually, or November 4th in England as the night before bonfire night, for all manner of pranks and vandalism. This night was indeed called Mischief Night. Property was egged, windows and light bulbs were smashed. Wagons were disassembled, placed on roofs, and then reassembled on top of them and left there, which is actually pretty childish. Simply puerile. My adolescence was nothing like this at all. This mischief eventually got way out of control. Mischief Night was a nationwide event for children to be burdens to society. Communities in America and Canada soon came together and decided to do something about it. They decided to redirect the children's energy toward harmless, eusocial fun, and decided to make Halloween a night for positive activities. When the children were bribed with candy, a deal was struck, and they were tamed. Trick-or-treating soon became a semi-official community event. As those kids grew up, however, they found themselves reluctant to stop having Halloween fun, and Halloween became a party for people of all ages. The modern Halloween celebration was taking place. A myriad of European traditions, mainly from Ireland and Scotland, were giving birth to this new holiday in America and Canada. Sugar rations during the Second World War put a damper on the celebration, but once the war was finished in the 1940s, the holiday took off. Halloween wasn't really so much about religion anymore, though some churches still organize Halloween get-togethers and things along those lines for children and families. Churches are a common location for trunk-or-treating, for example. The All Hallowtide is certainly important to Christians, but Halloween is kind of the secular offshoot. We'll come back to subjects like that and much more in a bit though. For now, we've left out quite a bit of an important part of Halloween celebrations: the origins of its myths, the monsters, ghosts, ghouls, and of course, the very important period in which these beings were on the center stage, the age of Gothic literature. It is no coincidence that many Halloween tales are set in the Victorian era, or roughly between 1830 and 1900. The stereotypical haunted house, even in today's world, is typically a Victorian one. The ghostly inhabitants of these houses? Well-mannered, educated, dapper, yet mysterious Victorians, who died in the oddest of circumstances. The Victorian era was the height of Gothic literature. Bram Stoker, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Robert Louis Stevenson, and other famous authors all lived in this era. There are those that would say that these authors even outdo us as far as making a good story goes in some cases. This is of course up to major debate. Recent generations have made some very good stuff, and many horror movies today have been major, equal inspirations to the Halloween celebration, but it is worth pointing out that we often find ourselves looking to these classics for inspiration. But even these clever Victorians looked even further back for inspiration themselves, to the legends and tales of their European heritage, of ghosts, vampires, bogeymen or boogeymen in America, demons, monsters, witches, the undead, and much more. Bram Stoker's Dracula was published on May 26, 1897. The story tells, and of course there will be no spoilers by the way, of a mysterious Count Dracula, a handsome, intelligent, and charismatic nobleman who lives in a castle in the Carpathian Mountains. With the help of a Mr. Jonathan Harker, he moves to England. This Count Dracula's mysterious side, however, is quite dark. He is, indeed, a parasitic, undead, blood-sucking monster. A vampire. When he arrives to England to feed upon the living by sucking their blood, thereby consuming their life force, it's up to a team led by Dr. Abraham Van Helsing to stop him. With the movies especially, Dracula has since been the inspiration for the archetypal vampire. Fanged teeth, a dark but gentlemanly or ladylike outfit with a cloak, pale skin, red eyes, and possession of supernatural powers, such as great strength, the ability to crawl along walls and turn into a bat, and a bite which may turn others into vampires. Fear not though, a vampire also has weaknesses, a sensitivity to sunlight, garlic, silver, and the crucifix. According to legend, a vampire can be killed with a silver bullet, a stake through the heart, or decapitation. Whether or not an inability to be seen in mirrors is strength or weakness depends on the situation, I suppose, but Count Dracula certainly hated mirrors. Count Dracula was historically based on Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, who was born around 1430. His father was given the title Dracul when he joined the Order of the Dragon, which we discussed very briefly in my Germany documentary. Dracul, in Old Romanian, meant dragon, though it later came to mean devil. This title then passed to his son. The point of this order was to defend Christendom against the invasions of the Ottoman Turks, who sacked the great Christian city of Constantinople during Vlad's lifetime. Vlad III is remembered as a cruel monarch. His favorite method of execution earned him the title Vlad the Impaler. Political enemies, criminals, adulterous women, and his Muslim Ottoman Turk enemies, whom he would spend much of his life fighting, were known to be impaled on pikes as a form of slow execution. Despite his successes, he was betrayed by the Hungarians and imprisoned, and eventually died while fighting the Turks. His body was cut to pieces and his head was sent to Istanbul, where it was impaled on a pike. The legends of blood-sucking creatures wandering the night are found well before Bram Stoker's time, and are fairly widespread across cultures, having developed independently of each other. In the late Middle Ages through the early modern era, the people of Europe searched heavily for an explanation to all the death that surrounded them. Many offered supernatural explanations. On some occasions, graves were dug up to investigate corpses which were believed to have been not so dormant. Those who dug up recently buried corpses were sometimes shocked at what they discovered. Hair and fingernail growth, blood on the corners of the mouth, and even bloating of the belly. In other words, corpses which looked quite lively. Today we understand that these changes occur naturally after death. Corpses swell from the gases of decomposition, and blood is pushed to the surface of the skin and out of the mouth. The skin recedes as it dries, making it look like hair, nails, and even teeth have grown. Corpses have even been known to groan as gas moves out from the esophagus. To the superstitious peasantry, however, these were signs that the corpses were alive and active, possibly even moving among them at night. When such corpses were discovered, they were often killed a second time by beheading or by having a stake driven through the heart. This inspired much of the European legend surrounding vampires. The situation got so bad that the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, who reigned from 1740 to 1780, was forced to send her Dutch physician Gerard von Swieten to disprove the existence of vampires. The aristocracy were quite annoyed with the vampire nonsense, and especially the defilement of graves. Even the laws passed across Europe attempting to ban the practice of digging up graves to re-execute vampires did not cause the legends to die, though. Another creature which may have influenced the vampire myth was discovered in the 17th century. The vampire bat, which feeds solely on the blood of other creatures, was discovered in the Americas, though bats had a long history of being regarded with suspicion before they were connected to vampires. Most Europeans, Native Americans, and Aboriginal Australians regarded them as some sort of evil, dark beings, but in some cultures, such as in China, they actually brought good luck. Suspicion of dark magic and evil was not directed solely towards corpses, however, but also to the living in society as well. Typically people who were strange, ugly, elderly, lived out in the countryside by themselves, and were primarily female. The people of 14th through 19th century Europe and America who lived in periods of high stress tended to regard such women as witches. Those who used dark magic and worshipped the devil, and who actively harmed others. Brooms, cauldrons, English countryside hats, and other attire and common everyday tools became the dress and instruments of their evil. Such women, when found guilty of practicing witchcraft, were often burned at the stake or executed in a variety of ways. The most famous witch hunt occurred between 1692 and 1693 in Salem, Massachusetts, the Salem Witch Trials. Over 200 people were accused in these Salem witch trials. 19 were found guilty and executed, and 6 others died in associated incidents. Overall, thousands of people, primarily women, across Europe and America would be killed for witchcraft throughout the centuries. The superstition surrounding these women gave rise to the archetypal witch. Perhaps some women were up to no good, but many witches were very likely innocent. Today, the only sure scientific way of determining whether or not an individual is a witch is to weigh them. If they weigh the same as a duck, this naturally would imply that they are made of wood. If they are indeed made of wood, then we must arrive to the conclusion that they are, in fact, a witch. Remember that on Halloween, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to avoid getting turned into a newt. Black cats are sometimes associated with witches. They are seen as either the animals of evil or are actually witches themselves who have shape-shifted into them. Throughout much of European history, they were regarded with suspicion and viewed as supernatural beings or creatures which brought bad luck. Although in some places in Europe, they were good luck. In some circumstances, people who owned black cats were punished or even killed, and the animals themselves were of course commonly killed as well. Apparently, it's worth mentioning, October 27th is Black Cat Day in the United Kingdom, which is held on August 17th in America. It seems to be a day dedicated to erasing stigma against the cats. Ghosts, zombies, skeletons, shades, ghouls, spirits, wights, wraiths, phantoms, apparitions. There are many names for the dead who rise from the grave in the many forms they may take. Perhaps mindless, reanimated corpses, an invisible spirit, or something in between, such as a girl in a burial shroud. No doubt, such legends have existed in nearly all cultures across times, most certainly even before recorded history. Nearly every town in America has a ghost story or two, a place you shouldn't go, especially at night, because of what supernatural beings might be lurking there. According to some polls, link in the description, between a third and half of all Americans claim to believe in ghosts. Around 18% of Americans claim to have actually had a ghost encounter. According to the wide variety of ghost tales, some of the undead are harmless, perhaps even pleasant, just wandering around an area where they met a terrible fate. Many are said to be wicked, however, such as the poltergeist, from the German meaning noisy ghost, a kind of ghost which is violent, throws things, and hurts people. The word zombie actually has an African etymology, which made its way to Haiti. Today, depictions of zombies are all over our media. A famous zombie, although not a typical zombie, is Frankenstein's monster, whose tale comes from Mary Shelley's 1831 book, Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. The monster was designed by a mad scientist, Victor Frankenstein. The word ghoul is Arabic, from a ghoul, a monster from the pre-Islamic Arabian religion which behaved very much like a zombie. A boogeyman, or sometimes the boogeyman, as a single specific character, comes from the Old English booga, meaning something frightening. The first mention of a goblin seems to come from the 12th century, referring to a kind of monster haunting the countryside of Normandy. Gremlins are similar beings, though accounts of what exactly a goblin or a gremlin is tends to vary. Tales of werewolves are quite ancient, dating back to at least the ancient Greeks, but likely earlier, as characters of a kind of Indo-European mythology. A werewolf is a person who, either by being cursed or by volition, becomes a wolf, or more commonly, a wolf man. The typical trigger for a temporary transformation is a full moon. The typical way in which one becomes a werewolf is, as I said, by a curse, or by being bitten or scratched by another werewolf. Though less commonly heard about, there were fears of werewolves alongside witches during the aforementioned time periods of high stress and witch hunts. Another famous author of Gothic fiction, perhaps the most famous, is the American Edgar Allan Poe, born January 19, 1809. Poe is best known for his short stories and poetry, some of which are required reading in American public schools. The Cask of Amontillado, The Raven, The Telltale Heart, and my personal favorite, The Mask of the Red Death, are just some of his best-known works. Such writing, however, indeed came from an equally somber man. Much of Poe's life was complicated, and his death is something straight out of one of his own works. On October 7, 1849, Poe was found wandering the streets of Baltimore, delirious and incoherent. He was taken to a nearby hospital where he rested until he died. Doctors were not able to communicate with Poe. He was evidently wearing another man's clothes and called out the name Reynolds multiple times. What exactly happened to Poe remains a complete mystery. Perhaps just as strange is the Poe toaster, or more likely at least two men, perhaps father and son, who, every year, from around 1930 to 2009, on Poe's birthday, left 3 roses and a bottle of cognac at his grave. The identity of the Poe toaster, or toasters, remains a mystery as well. These are just some of the creatures that haunt our minds and have an opportunity to come to life during Halloween, and just some of the authors to whom we owe such captivating and imaginative stories, around which much of our Halloween culture is based. We've gone over the history of many traditions, the religion, the mythology, and legends, some of Halloween's most famous characters, but there is more to discuss. How has the modern world shaped Halloween? What is it like in other countries? What is its future? And is it a dangerous holiday? The first president to celebrate Halloween in the White House was Dwight D. Eisenhower, introduced by his wife, Mamie Eisenhower, in 1958. Ever since then, celebrating the holiday has been a presidential activity and certainly an American activity. Likewise, Halloween is still common in Canada and even in Quebec, which is of course part of Canada but with its French origins culturally distinct. It's not entirely clear which country, America or Canada, had Halloween first, although the holiday was greatly developed in the United States. But what about the rest of the world? What other countries celebrate Halloween? It's a complicated question. The All Hallowtide is observed across the Christian world, but it is not the same thing as Halloween. Modern Halloween, though perhaps based on very ancient cultures and traditions, is something which came about in America. Americans are, as you might expect, the biggest celebrators of Halloween. An estimated $8.4 billion are spent each year on celebrating in the United States alone. Much of it is on candy. A quarter of all candy sales in the US occur during the Halloween season. The Celtic world still celebrates, of course, while maintaining its own cultural traditions as well. The English have largely welcomed the holiday alongside Guy Fawkes Day or Bonfire Night as well. Halloween is spreading across much of Europe, Oceania, and parts of East Asia, such as in Japan, the Philippines, and South Korea, but it is doing so slowly. People from these countries tend to see Halloween as an American thing and suspect that it's arrived to the countries simply because it's good money and helps pick up the monetary lull between summer and Christmas. Many, especially older generations, view Halloween as an Americanization of their culture and would prefer to simply get on with their own All Hallowtide practices if they have them. There is a somewhat similar celebration in spring called Walpurgisnacht in places like Germany and Scandinavia. Despite this, younger generations especially have embraced Halloween more. Much of Oceania has an Anglo-Celtic cultural origin. However, celebrating the holiday in New Zealand and Australia is a bit awkward, considering it's a different season there in October. I have a New Zealander friend who said that flowers blooming and warming temperatures doesn't exactly inspire the Halloween spirit, but it has gained some popularity there. There is a similar story in South Africa. Throughout much of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, Halloween is largely uncelebrated and viewed as a foreign thing. I fully respect the right of Europe and Asia and other cultures to reject Halloween if it doesn't fit into their culture, by the way. Throughout Latin America, a very similar holiday called the Dia de Muertos is celebrated. Mexico especially celebrates this holiday. It's rooted, of course, in the fact that Latin America is predominantly Catholic, with large influences from Spanish and Portuguese culture, but there are other traditions involved which likely date back to indigenous festivals, such as the festival dedicated to Mictlantecuhtli, the Aztec goddess of death. Dia de Muertos celebrations also vary from country to country. Some involve a 3-day festival, spanning the All Hallowtide. Graves are often visited by family and friends and decorated. A very common decoration are candles and the marigold flower. Food is left out for the dead as well. Skeletons are especially common symbols of the dead, and have inspired the very popular treat of the celebration, the sugar skull. A famous tradition involves building altars for the dead, often consisting of photographs of the deceased person in question, alongside pictures of the Virgin Mary and Christ on the cross. People often pray at them, honoring the dead and telling stories about their lives. The festival ends with a special mass. Halloween celebrations in America and Canada are as strong as ever, and there are no signs of the holiday losing popularity anytime soon. Every year, as the leaves change color, decorations begin to go up. Oh, who am I kidding? Big box stores have decorations and candy up for sale in July, for goodness sake. But anyway, despite this, could there be a threat to Halloween survival in the long term? Could it simply be too dangerous? Could there be razors, glass, drugs, or poison in children's candy and other actual evil afoot that could ruin the holiday for everyone else? The occurrence of this type of thing is well known, but in actuality, extremely rare. The warnings and reports you hear about every year are mostly based in myth, and blow up because of anxiety of the idea of such a thing, not necessarily actual events. On top of that, when there are actual events, they're so ambiguous that they're hard to disprove or look into. The truth is, there is no documented case of a child ever dying from Halloween candy that has been tampered with by a stranger and given to them during trick-or-treating. However, there have been incidents of people doing weird things with candy and actually trying to hurt children, and some deaths which were blamed on Halloween candy but were a part of a larger story. One of the first incidents seems to have come from 1964, from a woman named Helen File. Mrs. File felt there was an age limit to trick-or-treating, and she was quite serious about it. As a result, she gave out random objects like steel wool, dog biscuits, and poisonous ant buttons to teenagers whom she thought were too old to be trick-or-treating. Helen File was a bit of a weirdo, but she seems to have been harmless. She did not intend for children to eat these things, obviously, and none did, but she was still charged with child endangerment regardless. There were other incidents as time went on, actually resulting in children's deaths. These incidents blew up across the news. Unfortunately, the less exciting, though equally disturbing truths about such stories do not make the front page as often. Both incidents resulting in the death of children were linked to the parents of the children, not from trick-or-treating. One was a case of grave irresponsibility, the other cold-blooded murder, both of which were blamed on the trick-or-treating myths and hysteria. I can post links to these two stories in the description if you want to know more. There have been some circumstances where razors and needles were found in candy, but again, there has never been a death associated with the candy given out by strangers. These incidents are quite rare, and many of them were hoaxes. Despite this, from the 1980s up through the 2000s, many communities have offered the opportunity to X-ray children's candy. Ironically, if there's an actual regular danger to kids' safety on Halloween, it doesn't come from poison candy. It comes from cars. Statistics show children walking around on the streets face an increased risk of being hit by a car on Halloween night. So kids and chaperones, be safe. Drivers, don't be stupid. As far as candy goes, again, most of the fear is based on hysteria and myth, but we do live in a world with ridiculous people, so I'm still going to tell you to check your or your children's candy. Throw away anything that looks strange, even if it's just been opened slightly. Report to the police anything that definitely looks strange. Avoid eating homemade treats from people you don't know. Avoid the house where the freak lives. All that kind of stuff. I don't want to hear about any, oh yeah, this dude I watch on YouTube said it was safe type incidents, alright? There are many ways to celebrate Halloween. Trick-or-treating, partying and dancing, apple bobbing, costume contests, house decorating, ghost stories, maybe even house decorating contests, haunted houses, making foods, corn mazes, hay rides, pumpkin carving, maybe some slightly mischievous pranks. There are some traditions which have been lost over time, however. One tradition is to set a place for your past relatives at your dinner table in order to honor them. Another is to have what is called a dumb supper, a feast in which there is little talking, so that one may dine with the thoughts of those whom they have lost in mind. An old Scottish tradition, called an apple wedding, is related to the supposed ability to better tell the future on Halloween night. It involves cutting the peel of an apple off without breaking it, throwing it over your shoulder, and looking at what it foretells. Whatever letter the peel most resembles, when it lands, is the first letter of the name of the person whom you're going to marry. One tradition, which isn't that forgotten, is to light candles for the dead. This certainly isn't my invention, none of these are, but I have developed my own way of lighting candles. Each Halloween night, I light one candle for my paternal relatives who have died, one for my maternal, one for all my friends, neighbors, peers, and even pets who have died, and then an individual candle for everyone who has died since the last Halloween, whom I personally knew. So 3 candles no matter what, plus 1 individual candle for anyone that's died, as I said, since last Halloween. While I mentioned Halloween as a time for good fun, I do also like to incorporate some moments of seriousness in it. It is a good time to remember those whom we have lost, maybe to visit a grave and leave some flowers or something along those lines as well. Across Northern America, on October 31st, people will be celebrating Halloween. Well, almost. In some cases, Halloween, including activities like trick-or-treating, is celebrated on the closest weekend to Halloween. This is not the norm, I don't like telling people how to celebrate, but I will say that I don't much care for this. I have no problem doing Halloween activities on the closest weekend or throughout most of October in general, but in my humble opinion, Halloween itself falls on the 31st for a reason. Interestingly, the city in which I live also has designated trick-or-treating hours, generally 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Maybe it's just because I didn't grow up doing this kind of thing, but I've always felt that this is something people can generally handle for themselves. Growing up, it was just understood that trick-or-treating began around sundown and lasted until around 9 or 10 when the porch lights started going off. I've made my point, I think it's red tape, but I still participate. But privately, I ignore it as much as possible and still do as much as I can on the 31st itself. And that's perhaps the main point of Halloween. It's not about how much money we're willing to spend on decorations or costumes, nor how much candy we're able to collect, but rather the fact that communities across Northern America can come together to celebrate age-old traditions. It's a time for fun, a time to express yourself, to be creative, a time to celebrate the fall season around you, a time to come to terms with your fears in a light-hearted way, to become that which you fear for a night, and to act out a harmless fantasy, a time to do this with those you care about. So to summarize, here's Halloween in a nutshell. It is a very complicated mix of traditions with different origins. Halloween stems from All Hallows Eve. It may have its origins in Europe, specifically Ireland and Scotland, but it was in Canada and the United States that the holiday truly lit up. Many of the figures and characters of Halloween have very ancient origins, but were brought to life in the works of Victorian authors and modern movie makers. And